when we come to the structure of this 7-part structure of the Gospel of Mark, we can say that the Gospel of Mark begins in the desert and the Gospel of Mark ends at the tomb. We notice chapter 1, verses 1 to 13, and chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. The second broad part of the Gospel of Mark is when Jesus is within the precincts of Galilee. This begins in Mark 1:14 and ends in Mark 8:21. As contrasted with Galilee, Jesus is in Jerusalem for a shorter number of chapters. Notice there are almost 8 chapters when Jesus is in Galilee and only 4 chapters which are dedicated to Jerusalem, because basically Jerusalem, a lot of controversies take place and Jesus suffers and dies and is buried. So Jerusalem contrasts with Galilee. A miracle of blindness in sight, which is a miracle in which Jesus uses external methods and which the blind man is healed in 2 stages, begins what is known as the section of the way. And another miracle frames the section of the way. So you might say, when we look at the blindness in sight miracle in 2 stages, the blindness in sight where blind Bartimaeus is healed without any external methods and immediately without Jesus even touching him, they are in between, they are on either side of the section of the way. So this section of the hodos, or the section of the way, that is when Jesus is on his way or on the road to Jerusalem, is an important section in the Gospel of Mark. Now, a very brief explanation of the structure and the meaning of this structure. What exactly does the desert mean? What exactly does the tomb mean? So when we look at the desert and the tomb, which are once again contrasted, we can also see that not only are they contrasted, but they are also interrelated. What is the interrelation between the desert and the tomb? Human beings do not really live in the desert. They pass through the desert, and tombs are where corpses are laid or where dead persons are buried. And therefore, because human beings do not live there and pass through, the desert and the tomb are suitable for demons. And this is the reason why Jesus is tempted in the desert. This term desert in English is from the Greek eremos. Eremos can be translated as either a desert or a deserted place or a wilderness or a lonely place. Desert does not necessarily mean the physical desert always, though most times it does mean the physical deserted place at least, but it can also be translated as wilderness and a place where a person is alone. That is how desert or eremos must be interpreted. The Gerasene demoniac, we are told in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, is living and residing in tombs. So when Jesus encounters this Gerasene demoniac, he encounters the Gerasene demoniac in a tomb. There is the danger of being trapped in a desert. As a matter of fact, when there are sandstorms in the desert, then it's very, very dangerous for a person, and often people die in the sandstorm. And so there is the danger of dying or being trapped in the desert and also in the tomb. As far as a messenger is concerned, Mark has a messenger in both the desert and the tomb. As a matter of fact, in the desert, the messenger, the Malachi, who is sent by God and quoted by Mark in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 1, the messenger who is sent is John the Baptist. And John the Baptist plays the role of this messenger, the one who goes before, the one who announces. He plays it to perfection. Just as John the Baptist appears as a messenger in the desert, a young man, and Mark's young man is not an angel. Mark does not mention that this young man is an angel. There is no connection between this young man and the young man of Mark 14, verses 50 to 52. There is no connection. Mark simply mentions here a young man, and why young man and why not angel, we shall see when we come to chapter 16. But now this young man is the messenger. So John the Baptist is the messenger in the desert. The young man is the messenger at the tomb. And both of these young messengers speak of the local movements of Jesus. What do I mean by local movements of Jesus? John the Baptist says, the one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. So it is after John that the Messiah, or the one who is more powerful than John, will come. And the young man at the tomb tells the three women who come to the empty tomb to give a message to Peter and the disciples. And what is the message which the young man gives? He is going ahead of you to Galilee. So both the messengers, John the Baptist and the young man at the desert and the tomb respectively, speak of the local movements of Jesus. Jesus, however, will be trapped neither in the desert, nor will Jesus be trapped in the tomb. He passes through both. That is, he passes through the desert by overcoming temptation. And Mark does not give us the three temptations like Matthew and Luke do. Mark simply says that Jesus was driven by the Spirit into the wilderness or the desert, where he was tempted by Satan. And the angels came and ministered to him. And my interpretation is that Jesus passes through the desert by overcoming temptation, by not succumbing to temptation of Satan, by the grace he received and the grace he accepted at his baptism, and he passes through the tomb, through the resurrection, and the grace he received at his death. So the baptism and the death are extremely important events, because Mark is very, very clear to make an association with these two events. If at the baptism the heavens were rent open, at the death the veil of the temple is rent open. And so Mark makes that connection, as we shall see when we come to these texts proper. The next broad section, which begins in Mark chapter 1, verse 14, and ends in Mark chapter 8, verse 21, is what we may term as the Galilee section. Jesus, in these chapters, is within the precincts of Galilee. Jesus does not leave the precincts of Galilee. He is in and around Galilee physically, and that is why it is called the Galilee section, because of the physical position of Jesus within Galilee. As contrasted, there is the Jerusalem section. Chapter 11, verses 1 to 11 speak about the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And from then on, Jesus remains in Jerusalem, where he is accused, where he is convicted, where he is crucified, where he dies, and where he is buried. So Galilee is not simply a geographical location. It is true that Mark has positioned Jesus physically in Galilee in these 8 chapters, but that is not the only point about the Galilee section. It is more a theological position. And what do I mean by a theological position? In the Galilee section, there are many miracles and exorcisms. As opposed to the Galilee section, there are no miracles or no exorcisms in the Jerusalem section. Now here, I want to point you out to Mark chapter 11, verses 12 to 14, and Mark chapter 11, verses 20 to 21. You will notice that Mark chapter 11 is in the Jerusalem section. Why do I refer to these texts, Mark 11, 12 to 14, Mark 11, 20 to 21? Because in those verses, which are within the Jerusalem section, we will have the incident where Jesus curses the fig tree, and where only in the Gospel of Mark is the fig tree seen withered after the temple is cleared. And someone might say, how do you say that there are no miracles in the Jerusalem section when very clearly this is a miracle, namely the cursing and the withering of the fig tree? The reason why I say that there are no miracles is because that cursing and withering of the fig tree is not regarded by Mark as a miracle. And how do we know that Mark does not regard it as a miracle? Because Mark alone of all the synoptics, Luke does not have this scene in his gospel. Matthew has it, but in Matthew, the fig tree withers instantly because Matthew wants to show the power of the word of Jesus. Jesus speaks one word and it happens. That is Matthew's intention, but Mark wants to make an intimate connection between the fig tree and the temple. That is why on either side of the clearing of the temple, Mark has the cursing of the fig tree and the withering of the fig tree. More about this so-called miracle, which is not a miracle, when we come to chapter 11 of the Gospel of Mark. Now it is enough for me to say that in the Jerusalem section, there are no miracles, there are no exorcisms. The kingdom of God is proclaimed by Jesus in Galilee. As a matter of fact, the first words that are spoken by Jesus in the Gospel of Mark are in chapter 1, verse 15. In chapter 1, verse 14, Mark gives us 4 indicators, 4 pointers, 4 cautions, 4 symbols before Jesus can speak. Jesus speaks for the first time in 1:15. And in chapter 1, verse 15, what Jesus proclaims, not says, not teaches, but proclaims, is the kingdom of God. And you may have a question saying, but what is this kingdom of God? The kingdom of God is a metaphor, is a symbol, which is used largely by the synoptic gospels. Matthew will use the same metaphor, but he will term it kingdom of heaven to avoid speaking of God. In a roundabout manner, he will speak about God by referring to kingdom of God in his gospel. Mostly, not always, a few times he does use the term kingdom of God, but Matthew largely uses kingdom of heaven. Mark, however, will use kingdom of God, and so Luke following Mark. So kingdom of God is a metaphor. It is a metaphor for the reign of God, for the rule of God, when God will declare himself to be king. A time where there will be justice, a time where there will be peace, a time where there will be love. These are, you might say, three aspects of the kingdom. A situation in which justice will prevail, in which love will prevail, in which peace will prevail. This is what the kingdom of God is. And Jesus shows in a practical manner through both his words and his actions the true meaning, the real meaning, the practical meaning of this metaphor, kingdom of God. In the Jerusalem section, there is no proclamation of the kingdom of God. As a matter of fact, even though there is no direct proclamation, I would like to think that in the discussions which Jesus has with the religious authorities, with his adversary, whether it is the discussion or the dialogue or the argument, if you like, about his authority in Mark 11:27-33, whether it is through the parable of the vineyard or the murderous tenants in Mark chapter 12, verses 1-12, whether it is with regard to taxes to Caesar in Mark chapter 12, verses 13-17, whether it is with regard to the resurrection in Mark chapter 12, verses 18-27, whether it is with regard to the great commandment or the first commandment in Mark chapter 12, verses 28-34, and whether it is with regard to David's son in Mark chapter 12, verses 35-37, all of which are within the Jerusalem section. Jesus does, through his responses, say what the kingdom is. So even though there is no direct proclamation of the kingdom, in the manner in which Jesus responds to those who either come to argue with him or ask a question or come to trap him, in his responses we can see glimpses of the kingdom. So even though there is no direct proclamation, because Jesus is the kingdom, because he manifests the kingdom, because he proclaims the kingdom is always present in Jesus. Now, because there are miracles, because there are exorcisms, it makes sense to have the command to silence. And we saw that this command to silence is when Jesus heals some people, not all, when some witness the miracle, like Jairus, when some answer, like Peter, they are commanded to silence, and especially demons are commanded to silence. In the Jerusalem section, because there are no miracles, there are no exorcisms, as a matter of fact, as we saw, beginning from chapter 9, verse 9, where a time reference is given, there is no command to silence from chapter 9:9 onwards in the Gospel of Mark. In the Galilee section, there is by and large acceptance. As a matter of fact, if you read Mark chapter 3, verse 22, which is within the Galilee section, if you read Mark chapter 7, verse 1, which is within the Galilee section, what you realize there is that Jesus enters into a controversy, that there is rejection of Jesus. He is accused of Beelzebul, and he is asked a question about eating with defiled hands in chapter 7 and in chapter 3. And you notice what Mark says, Mark 3:22, the scribes who came from Jerusalem. In Mark chapter 7, verse 1, the Pharisees who make those allegations come from Jerusalem. So what Mark is telling us is, even within the Galilee section, when there is rejection of Jesus, it is not from the people in Galilee, it is from those who come from Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, the rejection of Jesus in the Galilee section is from two groups, and both are supposed to be insiders. The first is his family. In Mark chapter 3, verses 20 to 21, his family is told he's out of his mind and they come to restrain him. In Mark chapter 6, verses 1 to 6a, his townspeople reject him. So, Jesus is by and large accepted in the Galilee section. When he is rejected, the ones who do the rejection or the argument or the non-acceptance come from Jerusalem, Mark 3:22, Mark 7:1, or the other family, Mark 3:20 to 21, or the other townspeople, Mark 6:1 to 6. In Jerusalem, there is more rejection than acceptance. This rejection is seen in the rejection by the Sanhedrin in Mark chapter 14, verses 54 to 65, by the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities, and is seen in chapter 15, verses 1 to 15, by the Gentiles represented by Pilate. So the rejection of Jesus is complete in the Jerusalem section. There are two miracles of blindness and sight. In the first miracle, which is in chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, Jesus heals the man in two stages. We notice in the first stage, it is the man can see, but the people look like trees. It is one of two miracles in which Jesus uses external methods. There is another miracle of blindness and sight, which is the healing of blind Bartimaeus. In the first miracle, the man is not named, and at the conclusion of the miracle, after he is healed, he is sent away to his home. He is told, do not even enter the village. In the second miracle, the man is named. He is Bartimaeus, that is, Mark will translate once again as son of Timaeus. And after being healed, he follows Jesus on the way. When we look at these miracles and we see that a blind man is healed in both, and we see that the first healing is after a bit of effort, that the first healing requires external methods, that the first healing needs Jesus to reach out and touch the man and put his hand on his eyes. The first healing is after a struggle. We realize the second miracle is immediate. The second miracle, there is no external method. The second miracle is not in two stages, so we know that what Mark is doing is that he is narrating these miracles in this manner for a reason. He's not telling us that Jesus had difficulty with healing the blind man. He's not telling us that Jesus had to use external methods in order to heal. He's not telling us that Jesus could not know that the first stage, the man looks and sees people, they seem like trees walking. He's telling us all of that for a reason. And how can we conclude that all of that is told to us for a reason? Because the second healing miracle of another blind man, but of the same ailment, of the same impediment, of the same illness, is done immediately. So that means we got to ask ourselves, what is the reason why Mark narrates 8:22 to 26, the healing of a blind man, in two stages and with such a strong effort on the part of Jesus? And what is the reason why Mark narrates 10:46 to 52, the healing of blind Bartimaeus, in such a simple manner? What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. Lord, that I might see. Receive your sight, your faith has saved you. And the man is healed. And notice, he follows Jesus. Not simply follows Jesus, but Mark alone has these words or this phrase. He followed Jesus on the way. And that is why we say that Mark's section of the way begins after the first healing of a man, blindness and sight, and concludes the section of the way, that is the healing of the man who is blind and receives his sight. And Mark shows this conclusion of the section of the way by telling us that Bartimaeus, who was blind, and Bartimaeus, who can now see, follows Jesus on the way. And so the question is, what is the section of the way? And why is this section called the section of the way? This section is so called because, first reason is this: Jesus is constantly on the road. Luke has, in his gospel, beginning in chapter 9, verse 51, and ending in chapter 19, verse 27, what is termed in Luke as the travel narrative or the journey narrative. And the reason why it is called by those names is because beginning in Luke 9:51 and ending in 19:27, Jesus is moving. He's on the road. He's traveling. He's on a journey. In the Gospel of Mark, Mark explicitly does not state only that Jesus is moving or Jesus is traveling or that Jesus is on a journey. No, he states explicitly that Jesus is on the road, and he does it by telling us very, very clearly that in his gospel alone, not in the Gospel of Matthew, not in the Gospel of Luke, because even though these two Gospels, Matthew and Luke, also have in their Gospels, they have the passion and resurrection predictions, which they have taken from Mark, but it is only in the Gospel of Mark that these passion and resurrection predictions are all on the way. So in other words, in 8:31, in 9:31, and in 10:32 to 34, I repeat, in 8:31, in 9:31, and in 10:32 to 34, in these three places is Jesus constantly on the road. And finally, The reason why this section is called the section of the way is because in these verses, Jesus speaks about his way of life. After the passion and resurrection prediction, and I would like you to note this, though some commentators mistakenly speak about the passion predictions. No, they are both passion and resurrection predictions, because in all the three cases, I repeat, 8:31, 9:31, 10:32 to 34, in all three cases, Jesus never speaks about his passion without, in the same breath, speaking also about his resurrection. And finally, Jesus speaks in these verses, that is, beginning from 8:34 and moving on to chapter 9:1, beginning from chapter 9 verse 35 and moving on to chapter 9:40, beginning in chapter 10 verse 40 and moving to chapter 10 verse 45, he speaks about his way of life. In other words, if someone wants to follow Jesus, this is what they have to do. So in a summary form now, we can see that the Gospel of Mark begins in the desert. The desert is in chapter 1, verses 1 to 13, and ends at the tomb in chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. The broad section which follows the section of the desert is the Galilee section, in which Jesus is not only within the precincts of Galilee, but also in the Galilee section there is theology, namely that Jesus is accepted. He begins proclaiming the kingdom of God. He works miracles and he works exorcisms. And even if there is rejection within the Galilee section, it either comes from Jerusalem or it comes from his own people, his family, and his townspeople. As contrasted or even as opposed to the Galilee section, there are no miracles in the Jerusalem section, and I will speak about chapter 11, verses 12 to 14 and verses 20 to 21 as not being a miracle, but as more than a miracle, a sign which identifies the fig tree with the temple. So it is within the Jerusalem section that there are no miracles, no exorcisms, and therefore no command to silence. In the Jerusalem section, Jesus is rejected, and that rejection finally leads to his crucifixion and his death and burial in a tomb. One miracle where a blind man is healed, but in two stages, leads to the section of the way, and another miracle in which a blind man is healed immediately concludes the section of the way. So, on either side of the section of the way is the healing of blindness and the reception of sight. If in the first one, which leads to the section, there is a lot of effort which Jesus has to put in the second one, which leads to Jerusalem, there is no effort at all. This must give us an insight into how we are to read not only the section of the way where we can see there will be struggle, and the Jerusalem section where there will be no struggle whatever.